you for the verses we're going to look at here today. I thank you for the example, the practical example of seeing how a believer in you can live their life in faith with you and walk with you and to commit their way to you. I pray that we'd see and hear an example of you taking care of your children, and trust that you will take care of us. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, last week we met Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king, who would become governor for the people of Judah for 12 years. And we talked a little bit about that position of cupbearer. To us, it doesn't sound all that impressive, all that important. It sounds like just a guy who was a taste tester, maybe a waiter. It might have been a bit more important in reality, more like a chief butler in charge of the servants. But a cupbearer is hardly the person you'd expect to wind up as governor. As cupbearer, it was Nehemiah's job to test King Artaxerxes' food, so that if it was poisoned, Nehemiah was the one to die, not the king. So clearly, Nehemiah's life, at least to the Persian Empire, was much less valuable than the king's. He was not considered a trusted advisor or a close friend of the king. In fact, Nehemiah tells us he had never even been sad in the king's presence. And this shows us that the troubles of a servant are not important enough to bring down the king's mood at lunchtime. Yet from these humble beginnings, God is going to exalt Nehemiah to an important position of leadership and to get an important job done. The book of Nehemiah is his own memoirs, a first-person account. We don't call it memoirs at church, we call it a testimony. And that's what Nehemiah is. It is his testimony of how God used him and worked through him. In one sense, you can look at Nehemiah and look at it as a book on leadership. There are a lot of practical examples, case studies in the book of Nehemiah of leading a group of people. When you think of a typical person who would be the one to go buy a book on leadership, you might think of a young go-getter who thinks that he's destined for greatness, and people, somehow he wants to find a way to get people to follow him and do what he says. Or maybe the person that would read a book on leadership is the person that didn't really expect or want a position of leadership, but now here they are and they feel overwhelmed and they start looking for advice. But Nehemiah wasn't really either one of those things. He did not begin his path to governorship as a career goal, but he also didn't just wander into it by accident. Nehemiah's path to leadership began with 4 months of prayer. 4 months of frequent, fervent prayer. And in those months, God moved Nehemiah from a person that was in mourning to a person who would take action. So while the book of Nehemiah is a book on leadership, it's also a book on prayer. And I wondered as I thought on that idea that Nehemiah prayed for 4 months before he wound up in this position of leadership, I thought back to when I started college, Bible college, studying to be a pastor. All I did was tick a box on the college application of what major I wanted to study. And I wonder if maybe they should have said to they called them preacher boys, which I always thought was corny, but that's what they called us. I wonder if they should have told those preacher boys, don't tick that box until after the first semester's over. And why don't you pray about it if that's what you really want to do for 4 months, instead of just throwing us in. And I wonder if that would be good advice for anyone pursuing a position of leadership. Why don't you pray about it for a few months before you just volunteer? Well, God took Nehemiah and changed him from a mourner into a leader. Do you remember why Nehemiah was mourning? At the beginning of chapter 1, we read that he had just had a visit from those who had returned from Jerusalem with troubling news. This was his brother and some of his associates, and they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. When we compare this news that the walls of Jerusalem were broken down, that the gates were burned down, to the book of Ezra, we find that the Jews had begun rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem, but that the people of the land around them had sent letters to King Artaxerxes warning that if the Jewish people had rebuilt the city, they would surely rebel against him. And these warnings were unfortunately not without merit. The Jewish ancestors had made and broken many alliances in the past, and now the current generation was suffering for the sins of the ancestors. So that vulnerability and shame in the city drove Nehemiah to mourning, but his mourning drove him to prayer. This again is that first dynamic of spiritual leadership, the relationship between a leader and his God. And when we looked at Nehemiah's prayer, one thing that stands out to us is how intense his prayer was. He says, I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. He says, I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. He said, I now pray before you day and night. And when you look at the verses of chapter 1 and 2, you can add up those 4 months on the Jewish calendar. In those 4 months of weeping and mourning and fasting and praying, God takes Nehemiah from one who's mourning over the trouble of his people into one who is a determined leader, ready to face and address the problem. And so Nehemiah chapter 1 ends after 4 months of prayer that he makes this request before God. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name, and give success to your servant today, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Today's the day. After 4 months of praying, Nehemiah dedicates this day, this conversation, this approach to King Artaxerxes, that he's going to bring to him the trouble in Jerusalem, these burned down gates and broken down walls, and he prays, may God give me success. So if the first dynamic of spiritual leadership was the relationship between the leader and his God, the next is to the leader and his human superiors. Now, I don't want to assume, though, that everyone here is familiar with the details of Nehemiah's story. So before I start talking and trying to make applications for us, let's just read what happened next. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. So it says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Maybe as we were reading that account, you already started noticing attributes of successful leadership. And there's examples there of proper respect for authority, of Nehemiah having done research and planning and being solution-oriented. And as we look at those principles, I want us to also consider some of the historical and contextual details. And I want to say, to give credit where credit is due, a lot of these leadership principles were mentioned in books written by Cyril J. Barber and James Montgomery Boyce. I don't expect you to go read those, but I want to give credit and say where this stuff's coming from. Well, the first principle we see Nehemiah demonstrate, if you want to fill in the blanks on the bulletin, this is the first, is respect for authority. How can we see Nehemiah's respect for authority? First, consider how Nehemiah approached the king. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in the king's presence. I have to say, I'm glad that we took a couple weeks and studied the book of Esther, because in the book of Esther, we get a behind-the-scenes, inside look into the Persian monarchy and the royal court, and it helps us put Nehemiah's job into context a little bit. Remember, Esther, even as the queen, the favorite of all the king's wives, she was under strict restrictions about when and how she could approach the king. Remember, Mordecai came to her and he said she needed to go stop Haman's plan for genocide, murdering all the Jews, and she was unsure what to do. So she told Mordecai, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out his golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I've not been called to come into the king these 30 days. In the Persian court, there were rules even for the queen to approach the king. And Esther says, he's not called me for a month. So she had not gone to him either. And if she initiated a meeting by walking into the throne room, he could have had her killed if he did not raise his scepter and give her permission. So we see there's this right way and a wrong way to approach the king. If you didn't know this about Leslie, she's an Anglophile. She loves to read about British history. She thinks it's especially lame that Europe has castles 4 times as old as the United States. And she has told me that if she ever has a chance to meet royalty, I'm not invited. She's afraid I'll start chanting USA, USA, or no taxation without representation, or something like that. Leslie thinks I don't know how to approach royalty. Well, the British royal family is not my authority or yours, unless one of you has dual citizenship I don't know about. But there is a right way for us to approach our human authority or our superiors. Two important passages for a Christian to consider in terms of his relationship to authority and relating to his authority, his superiors, are Romans chapter 13 and Ephesians 6. Romans 13 addresses our government authority, and it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, this passage is about respect for government officials and presidents and governors and mayors and judges and police officers and so on. And as parents, we try to teach our children respect for these men and women in authority over us. But as we get older, we get to look at them and we see that they're humans too, and they have as many flaws as we do, and it becomes sometimes harder to maintain that respect. We must obey God rather than men when it comes to that, but we also must obey the ones that God has placed over us. Now, if I worked for a person that thought he had the same authority over me as a police officer or the president, I don't think I'd enjoy that job, and I don't think I'd stay there very long. But what do you do in the meantime? Ephesians 6 says, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man." These words Paul wrote were addressed to bondservants. This is not the same as American slavery with all of its evils, but that doesn't mean it was always an enviable position either. So a bondservant might be a nonviolent criminal whose years of service as punishment were auctioned off. They might be a poor person who got stuck in debt to a rich man, and so he had to work it off. Or it might have been a poor person that signed a contract with a rich family to work for a number of years in exchange for being trained in a particular skill or given an education at the rich man's expense. It was not like our jobs where you could quit and just try something else. I've walked out of a job. That we can do that in our country, in our culture. But this bondservant was under contract, whether from crime, whether from debt, or whether from some kind of contract. And that's the background for the book of Philemon. Until that contract was up, Paul tells those bondservants, you work in a way that honors your masters. And as long as we're employed by somebody, that's what we owe our bosses too. If a person is going to pay you, you need to do the job that they require to the best of your ability. Well, here comes Nehemiah, and he knows the respect and the authority that he owes the king. He knows the right way to approach authority, and he has more access to the king than Esther had to Ahasuerus before. Most people give the waiter permission to bring them their food. And just as Esther was taught everything that she would need to do to please Ahasuerus if she would be king, Nehemiah was trained everything he was going to do if he was going to be a good cupbearer. And the example he gives is that he was not to be sad in the king's presence. But Nehemiah takes the chance and comes in with a sorrowful face. And thankfully, this does not disturb the king, but instead, he asks the servant, "What's wrong?" And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart." Then I was very much afraid. Again, by Nehemiah's admission that he was afraid, we see that he was breaking proper court procedure by coming in with a sad face. Perhaps the king might even wonder if this cupbearer's change in disposition, maybe he's not feeling too good. Maybe there was something he already tried that isn't sitting well with him, and maybe I better check on that. Well, Nehemiah says, "I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Here's a couple principles of leadership that fit under that idea of respect. First, we can see Nehemiah's loyalty. He is about to come to the king and ask him to change one of his decrees. Remember, the king had decreed the walls not be built till he said so, and Nehemiah is going to ask him to say so. Before doing so, he assures Artaxerxes, "I'm not against you, king." He greets him with, "Let the king live forever." This is not merely a formal address, and it's not just him trying to get on the king's good side. Nehemiah's role as cupbearer may be to give his life for the king if someone had poisoned him. Nehemiah comes and he seems to have the king's best interest at heart. Sometimes when a person is seeking a higher position at a job, they think that the best way they can get there is by tearing down their manager or the bosses ahead of them. I read a quote that said, "Contrary to popular legend, subordinates do not, as a rule, rise to position over the prostrate bodies of incompetent bosses." You're more likely to succeed by supporting the manager, the boss that you have above you. But likewise, Nehemiah's loyalty is not blind loyalty. He's being respectful. He's coming to the king, but he's coming to the king to say, I think you got this one wrong. But he does that tactfully. The commentaries point out that at this point in the conversation, Nehemiah did not mention the city of his father's graves was Jerusalem, the one the king said, don't rebuild. Remember again, Artaxerxes had said, therefore make a decree that these men may be made to cease and this city not be rebuilt until a decree is made by me. Nehemiah did not storm into the courtroom 4 months ago at the news of his brother. He doesn't argue with all of the accusations that Artaxerxes has heard that the Jews might rebel. Instead, he comes in with a sad face and he expresses his own personal grief to the king. And Nehemiah's sadness catches the king's attention. Nehemiah approaches respectfully, he shows loyalty, he shows tact, and because of this, the king is ready to hear Nehemiah's request. And now Nehemiah's request is another important aspect of leadership. The second blank to fill in there is that a leader is a person who will stand in the gap. It says, then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Before we get to Nehemiah's request to the king, his offer to stand in the gap and to take charge, we should notice he first makes a request to God. This is what he's been praying for 4 months. And that's a very different prayer from last week in chapter 1, wasn't it? Chapter 1 was a summation of 4 months of private, intense, fervent prayer. We saw his adoration of God, praising his greatness and awesomeness and love. He confessed the sins of his people and his own family. He thanked God for the promises that he had made to the people and called on God to remember those promises. And finally, he prayed and requested that God would give him success in the dealings with Artaxerxes. This time he doesn't say anything that he said. He just says, I prayed to the God of heaven. It's certainly a shorter prayer, isn't it? This verse was first pointed out to me by a lady named Emma Lou Mason. She was the camp cook at Red Cliff Bible Camp where I attended as a kid. We called her Ma Mason, and she taught a devotional to a group of us junior counselors. The camp had a 2-week program for kids that wanted to be a counselor. It was called the SALT program, Servants as Leaders Training. So we were called SALT campers. And I don't think it was an original with Ma Mason, but she taught us this prayer of Nehemiah's. She called it an arrow prayer. I saw somebody else call it a throwing up a dart. That Cyril Barber I mentioned called it a prayergram. Do my kids know what a telegram is? Have you ever heard of that? Emma went like this. She's seen the ... We don't have telegrams anymore. Actually, I think you can, but we don't use them. So I was thinking the modern version is it's a prayer text message. Sometimes you can sit down and pray for a long period of time like Nehemiah did. We talked on Thursday night about making a prayer list. We have prayer lists on the back of things that people have brought to the church, and sometimes you can sit and stop and think carefully through those prayers. You could pray through the Lord's Prayer or the ACTS we looked at last week in prayer. That was Nehemiah's prayer in chapter 1. Here's a second prayer. He has no time for such a formal prayer, and he fires off this quick arrow message with a message tied to the end of it, a prayer to God, a spiritual instant message. A spiritual leader, or any leader really that's a Christian, is going to find himself or herself in need of such quick prayers frequently. All of us should find ourselves in the need of such prayers frequently. That's what it means to pray without ceasing. When confronted with a challenge at home, a disagreement, or even a fight with your kids, or if you're a student about to make a presentation that you've been working on or take a test you've been studying for, when you're at work and run into a difficult customer or problem, that's a time for this kind of arrow prayer. There probably isn't time before a meeting to pause, go into a back room, and have a 10-minute prayer time with God before you go make a sales pitch. But there's always time to pray to the God of heaven like Nehemiah does here. Nehemiah has been praying night and day for 4 months that God would give him success, and today's the day. He fires off that prayer and he speaks his request to the king. I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. Here is Nehemiah standing in the gap. The prophet Ezekiel ministered during the exile, while the Jews were under the captivity of Babylon. And God spoke to him about the time before the captivity. God told Ezekiel he was looking for someone who would be a righteous leader for the people, and there was no one. God spoke to Ezekiel and said, the people of the land have practiced extortion. They've committed robbery. They have oppressed the poor and needy and have extorted from the sojourner without justice. And I sought for a man among them who should build up the wall and stand in the breach before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found none. The Lord looked for someone to stand in the breach, not of a literal wall, as in the case of Nehemiah, but one that would stand against the evil in the land. A spiritual leader must see these problems, and instead of throwing up his hands and saying, it's too much for me to handle, stand in the place that is available to him. Look at the examples of Ezekiel. Do we see greed and extortion around us? Do we see oppression of the poor? Do we see the sojourner treated without justice? We need to stand in the gap and call it out, or will God look around and say, I found no one? I have to say that I don't think Nehemiah's prayer began as a request that God would raise him up and make him a governor. I don't think he had any political aspirations after his brother visited him. But that's something that happens with prayer. God takes us from a person who's praying about a problem and changes us into someone doing something about the problem. And again, those 4 months of prayer have transformed Nehemiah from a servant with a pretty cushy job to a guy who is ready to sacrifice it all that comfort and all that privilege in order that God would use him to deal with the trouble in Jerusalem. I think also of the prophet Isaiah's commission from God. In Isaiah chapter 5, we read Isaiah's long list of woes and judgment against the sins of the land. And everything Isaiah says is accurate. All of it was true. He says, woe to those who join house to house, who add field to field until there's no more room, and you are made to dwell alone in the midst of the land. Woe to those who rise up early in the morning, that you may run after strong drink, who tarry late into the evening as wine inflames them. Woe to those who draw iniquity with cords of falsehood, who draw sin with cart ropes. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Isaiah was right about this diagnosis of all the sin around him. And I don't know at what point of in his ministry he wrote chapter 5, but he presents it to us as chapter 5, a condemnation of all the sin of the land, and then he sees God on his throne in chapter 6, and he says, woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And at this repentance of his own sin, this confession of sin, like we saw Nehemiah do, like we saw Ezra do, Isaiah is forgiven and redeemed. And then God puts out a call to go deliver this message against the sin. I heard a voice from the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here am I, send me. After a view of God in heaven, Isaiah sees the problem of sin even more clearly, and instead of merely standing up and rightly condemning it, he volunteers to go be the one to do something about it. He will go and deliver God's message. I don't know if Nehemiah started his 4 months of prayer with the attitude of, "Here am I, send me." But now that is the request he makes to the king. Nehemiah sees that there's a lack of effective leadership in Jerusalem, so he steps up, he stands in the gap, and he volunteers. Now, standing in the gap sounds exciting and heroic. It sounds like a battlefield where the man in the front line falls and the next soldier steps up, picks up his gun, and takes his place. In our life, we can often identify problems at home or at work. We're all really good at pointing out the problems of government and politics, but that's not what standing in the gap means. Nehemiah has a solution. And this part might not sound as exciting and thrilling as standing in the gap, but if standing in the gap is going to make any difference and accomplish anything, Nehemiah and we need to make a plan. That's the last blank there. Nehemiah made a plan. And we can see this in his conversation with the king. The king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. Notice that Nehemiah mentions in passing that the queen was there with Artaxerxes, and he doesn't mention anyone else. Like in Esther, it says that Ahasuerus met with the 7 princes of Persia. Nehemiah only mentions the queen, so maybe this is another example of Nehemiah tactfully coming with a private meal, not in front of all of the king's leaders to say, "I want you to overturn that decree you made. I want you to exercise that loophole you built in." But also notice that Nehemiah has not been idle over these 4 months of prayer as God began to move his heart to stand in the gap and take on this challenge of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah has been making a plan. The king said, "How long will you be?" And Nehemiah gave him some kind of a time frame. How did he know? What does a cupbearer know about construction projects? How long do you think it takes to build the frame for a new store or a restaurant? I have no idea, but do you know who does? Ask John. Nehemiah did that. He went and found someone who was building. I don't know who he talked to in Susa, the citadel, but he said, "How long will it take to build walls?" And he had an answer to give the king. Nehemiah had done some planning. He knew time to add for travel. And he even thought about the permits that he would need. "I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple and for the wall of the city and for the house that I shall occupy." Nehemiah wants letters from the king to give him safe passage. These governors beyond the river are probably the same ones that had written to stop the building in the first place. So Nehemiah says, "I want a letter with permission to go through their land till I get to Judah." He further asks for the king to write a letter to provide wood for the building of the walls around the temple, walls around the city, and a house for Nehemiah. And he even knows the guy's name who's in charge of the forest. Whatever the time frame was he gave to the king, it was long enough that he says, "I better build myself a house at the same time, not just a temporary place to stay." Have you ever had a boss that said, "Don't bring me your problems, bring me your solutions"? That's not my favorite phrase to hear from a boss. It sounds like they don't care, but I guess it's better than "it is what it is," denying that there are any solutions. Nehemiah does that. He comes with a solution. He has a plan. The New American Commentary had this quote about praying and planning, and it says, "God's work and our planning are not contradictory. Neither is research contrary to dependence on God. Prayer is where planning starts." Nehemiah modeled good leadership. He prayed, planned, and acted in dependence on God and submission to his guidance. What do we do when a problem presents itself at work or school or home or church? What do you do when you see that there's a need that needs filled? What do you do when you see an opportunity available for yourself or for the church? Do we jump in impulsively? We might get excited. We might say, well, stand in the gap. That's probably better than saying someone should really do something about that and walk on by. But if we stand in the gap with no plan, with no research, we probably won't accomplish anything. And I know it's another old saying that failing to plan is planning to fail. So here's Nehemiah's plan. He approaches the king respectfully. He's identified the problem and he's offered to stand in the gap, and he will lead the way in solving the problem. Furthermore, he's made a plan and he's presented that to the king. And he's been praying and praying. He's prayed for success today. Today, he prays for success before the king. And here's the answer from the king, but also the answer from God. The king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. You can pick up a lot of leadership principles from Nehemiah that you could apply to any person in leadership. You could look at this passage and come away with, here's how to gain your boss's favor, here's how to even change your boss's mind. Respect and tact will take you farther in your career than shouting at your boss. Bosses like to see a go-getter who stands in the gap. They like to see a person who's done planning and comes to them organized. Those are principles you can pick up just from experience in the workforce. But Nehemiah doesn't talk about all those things. He doesn't talk about how clever he was. He recognizes, like Ezra did before him, and like he will again and again in this book, that all of that success comes from the hand of God. This is the second time that Nehemiah has used that phrase in his testimony, his memoirs. The first was in his prayer in chapter 1, when he reflected on God's promises to his people. He said, "They are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and your strong hand." In chapter 1, God's hand is seen as that strong hand, God's great acts of power, like the Exodus or the sovereign choice of Abraham and the great acts of the covenant. But God's hand is not only a strong hand that pushes things through. In chapter 2 today, we see that God's hand is also the hand of an artist, a detailed hand, orchestrating the minute details of history, that Nehemiah would be the cupbearer at this time to this king, and his brother would come back from Jerusalem 4 months ago. We see it's the guiding hand of a father taking that sadness of Nehemiah's heart in chapter 1 and moving him to one who would stand in the gap and be a leader and take action. As Christians, we can make plans, we can do research, we can get advice to handle a problem. All of those are actions of leadership, and all of those show wisdom. But a Christian must ultimately lean on God to act. King Solomon showed that we cannot have success apart from God. He put it like this, that unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And Solomon's father David put it more positively, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act. Today we saw Nehemiah as an example of how a leader should relate to his superiors. We saw that he should have respect and tact and loyalty towards his superiors. We saw that he would stand in the gap when a problem arises and make a plan to deal with that problem. But we must not, as we talk about this dynamic of a leader and his superiors, we must not lose sight of that first dynamic of a leader and his God. Nehemiah made all of these plans, but he committed them carefully to God in prayer. When the opportunity came to present that plan, Nehemiah took the chance, prayed to God again, and God granted him success. May we commit our ways to God as well and trust in him to act. Let's pray. Dear Father, I pray that you will make us people willing to step up and stand in the gap when opportunities arise in our work, in our school, in our homes, in our church. Keep us respectful towards our authority, that we would not tear them down, but support them as best we can while we obey God and not man. Give us wisdom that we can make the best plans and commit them to you, but let us not rely on our own wisdom and our own plans for success. Let us look for your hand and your blessing. In Jesus' name, amen.